As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the Times of Israel reported on Wednesday that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vetoed hostage deal talks without consulting his war cabinet, infuriating families of Israeli hostages in Gaza. So Netanyahu said no more talks on a potential hostage deal with Hamas. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum, which is a group representing relatives of most of the Israeli hostages in Gaza, said that it was stunned by Netanyahu's move to end the talks. The group said in a statement, quote, "It appears that some of the members of the cabinet decided to sacrifice the lives of the hostages without admitting it," end quote. The group also said that it was a death sentence for the Israeli captives who remain in Gaza. Israeli media is reporting that war cabinet members Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot of the National Unity Party are furious over Netanyahu's move, and they met on Wednesday to discuss their response. So Gantz, is an opposition figure. He was a defense minister in a previous Netanyahu government a few years ago. It was a coalition deal. He was supposed to take over as prime minister eventually, but that government was dissolved. So he joined the war cabinet when this thing first, when things first started in October. So he's not happy about Netanyahu doing this. And the veto came after Mossad chief David Barnea met with U.S., Egyptian, and Qatari officials in Cairo on Tuesday to discuss a potential hostage deal. And so the U.S. Air Force and Space Force announced a plan for a major overhaul of force structures to prepare for a future war with China in the Asia Pacific. So even though they got all this going on in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Middle East in general, they're still preparing for this future confrontation with China. So the plan was announced on Monday by Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall and other officials, and it includes a total of 24 changes, including 16 for the Air Force, 5 for the Space Force, and 3 for the entire Department of the Air Force, which the Space Force falls under. So Kendall said at a Air Force, some sort of symposium this week, he said, quote, "We are out of time. Why do I say that? It's not that I enjoy sounding like a broken record. It's because for the last 2 decades, China has been building a military that is designed, purpose-built to deter and defeat the United States if we intervene in the Western Pacific," end quote. So according to military.com, the majority of these changes are kind of vague and just renaming things and rebranding efforts aimed at focusing on what they call great power competition. But some of the changes are significant, including bringing back warrant officers, which have not existed in the Air Force for 65 years. So as far as I understand it, a warrant officer is usually, one level above the enlisted, but below commissioned officers. And they want to bring back this position specifically for them to focus on information and technology warfare. So Air Force Chief of Staff General David Alvin said that the idea of bringing back the rank is to have airmen who want to code for the country and be network attack people. That's how he put it. So it sounds like cyber operations and things like that. And he also said another thing that they're trying to focus on is large-scale military exercises instead of the smaller-scale drills that it has prioritized for the past few decades, sort of counter-terrorism stuff. Now they're preparing for the big one with China as well as Russia. Articles from Brett Wilkins. And Amnesty International on Tuesday renewed its call for the U.S. government to drop charges against jailed WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, whose final hearing before the United Kingdom's High Court regarding his extradition to the U.S. is fast approaching. So Assange's hearing, which is expected to be his final hearing to appeal extradition to the United States, where if he's convicted, he could do he's facing up to 175 years in prison for his journalistic activities for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing documents he obtained from Chelsea Manning from a whistleblower, which is a standard journalistic activity. So this would just huge implications for the press freedom in this country and around the world because the U.S. is extraditing him. So the hearing is February 20th and the 21st. So Amnesty has been calling for the charges to be dropped against Assange, and they're kind of making the call again. So I think it's important for us to focus on this. And one thing I know, like Assange's wife and Assange activists, the thing that they want Americans to do is basically call their representatives and senators and just bug them about this and tell them, I know there's a resolution in the House that calls for the U.S. to drop the charges against Assange. That's something you can do is call your House rep and say, hey, support this resolution. It's a huge threat to our freedoms, to the First Amendment. So it's, hopefully, I don't know, this kind of stuff makes a difference when it comes to the ruling of the High Court in the UK. Articles from Responsible Statecraft. And basically, there is a report from a U.S. government watchdog that says ISIS is depleted. They're not a big threat, no threat to the American homeland. So basically, all this talk that's how the U.S. still justifies its presence in Iraq and Syria, even though it's clearly not about ISIS. It's clearly about countering Iran and their allies, the Shia militias who operate in Iraq and in eastern Syria. So this report, it paints a dismal picture of the once powerful ISIS's operations in Iraq and Syria, where it controlled huge swaths of territory in the mid-2010s. The watchdog says, quote, ISIS's capacity to conduct insurgent activities remain severely degraded in Iraq and Syria, end quote. And also, ISIS attacks have significantly dropped since 2020. And the group's operations now appear more akin to a failing crime syndicate than a powerful terror group. Crackdowns on ISIS finances have left the organization unable to consistently pay its fighters. The report said that ISIS leaders are paid only sporadically, so just not a cohesive group. Just these remnants remain in these rural areas of Iraq and Syria.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Well, the country's falling apart. We know that. The Senate debated and in the cover of darkness in the middle of the night voted overwhelmingly to send $98 billion to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. One of the senators, Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, a liberal Democrat, stood on the floor of the Senate and said the Israelis are war criminals. But I'm voting for this bill anyway because they're our allies. They're not our allies. Ukraine is not an ally. We don't have treaties with either country. The turmoil in either country does not affect American national security one whit. Rand Paul gave a gifted and strong speech against all this, but the vote was overwhelming. It was like 22 to 78 or something like that. It was more than enough to allow this to happen outside of the normal Senate rules. Now it goes to the House of Representatives, where, of course, President Biden has been pushing very hard for it. It turns my stomach that the American government can finance genocide in the name of the hardworking taxpayer by borrowing money in the taxpayer's name. And it turns my stomach that we bow to government. Somebody asked me this morning on a podcast, Victor Davis Hanson of Stanford says that we need stricter controls at the border. I understand that argument. We need people at the border to swear that they understand the Bill of Rights. Oh, really? We don't even have a government that understands the Bill of Rights. And you want minorities that can't speak English to understand the Bill of Rights? How about starting with the government? The Bill of Rights doesn't grant our rights. It restrains the government from interfering with them. And it's doing a pretty lousy job because the government has turned the Bill of Rights into a bill of governmental privileges. All right. Sorry for getting carried away.
The Bill of Rights into, what did you say? A bill of governmental privileges.
Temporary government privileges.
Yep. As they say, the fish rots from the head down. And we got rotten fish right at the top over there.
My argument is that people accept the loss of virtue and expect the loss of virtue. The government doesn't stand for virtue. Its laws are not based on virtue. Its laws are just based on power. Like, let's borrow $61 billion and give it to Ukraine. They're on life support, but let's waste the money anyway. Let's borrow $17 billion and give it to Israel on top of the $6 billion we've already given Israel. They are slaughtering innocent babies, but let's give them the money anyway because we're under pressure from AIPAC and other members of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. You can't call that virtuous. That's just power. That's power destroying. That's power stealing, lying, and destroying. Nietzsche also said, listen, I'm not a fan of his. He was crazy. But Nietzsche also said everything the government has it is stolen and everything the government says is a lie. Both statements are almost literally true. The stolen is absolutely true. The second is for the most part true. Even a stop clock is right twice a day. Occasionally the government says something that's not a lie, but for the most part, it is filled with lies.
They're going to ramp. Israel's going to ramp this up. They're going to start attacking Lebanon. They're going to escalate the attacks in Syria. And next is going to be Iran. And when Iran gets into this war, that's going to be the official beginning of World War III.
Well, we'd have a hard time providing military assistance 7,000 miles away from the U.S. We can't do it. I don't. Joe Biden would probably do it on his own without a declaration of war. The Congress is corrupt in that it will do whatever AIPAC wants it to do. Yeah. It'll be a very, very sorry state of affairs. McGregor and Ritter tell me that Iran is a substantial substantial military with substantial missiles and weapons. And the Israelis would be crazy to attack Iran, but that's what Netanyahu wants, and that's what he's provoking over there. When those three unfortunate members of the Georgia National Guard were killed by a drone at that Tower 22 place somewhere on the border between Jordan and Syria, 3 people killed, 42 injured. Joe Biden responded with 86 different attacks, killing dozens and dozens of civilians. Collective punishment is expressly prohibited by the Nuremberg Convention. Nobody follows the laws anymore. No American president feels constrained by the Constitution. They do whatever they want. The lust to kill overwhelms them.
So, again, we're still on the course of destruction. And I don't know what's going to change it. But if we don't, empires come and go. Did you like the Roman Empire? No, the Egyptians were great. Now, how about one after another? They kill themselves because of the wars that they keep fighting.
And the debt that they incur.
Yep. The debt, it's only $34.1 trillion.
Right.
And what they just passed, you said almost $100 billion, stealing more of our money, taxpayer money, to keep bloodying the killing fields.
Yes.
And this is not the America that we grew up with, that we were taught about and believed in. And it's so sad to see it decline.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
We've got Boris Johnson responding to the Tucker Carlson interview. So it's interesting. We've been talking about, and part of the problem for a long time, that it seemed like a peace deal had been worked out in Ukraine. It was reported. I don't remember where we had gotten this from. It's the Russian talking points. They come over, you memorize them, you spin them on the podcast, and then you just forget about it. But I remember it's something that we've been talking about for a while. It had been out in the ether. And that's what's fun about when Tucker Carlson or other people report on these things, is you get this information to a much wider group of people, that more people can understand the fact that we could have dodged countless Ukrainian deaths for absolutely no reason. Remember, people decided to fund this war. They lied to us to say that it was being a victory. The whole thing could have been avoided. Nice and simple. You could have just not done the war. But no, we decided we had to talk them into it. We have to ruin their peace deals. And so here was Boris Johnson commenting on the Tucker Carlson piece.
Around the world, people are watching that ludicrous interview with Vladimir Putin conducted by Tucker Carlson, and we must not fall for this tissue of lies, above all for the notion that Putin is somehow fated to succeed in Ukraine. On the contrary, he is doomed to fail. Read about it in the Daily Mail.
All right, so I was curious to read about this in the Daily Mail. Here's Boris Johnson. And this is incredible. After 2 or maybe 3 years at this point of this failed, hey, we're winning in the Ukraine war, they're still trying to sell us on the idea that if we send them $86 billion, that's somehow going to do something other than just get more Ukrainians killed. Instead of finally waking up to the fact, hey, this thing was failed, this was a bad idea. I could have told you that in week 1 when China and India didn't get our back in the operation. All right, this thing seems to not be working. They're still selling this lie. Remember, Chuck Schumer even said it, that Putin's going to go in and he's going to go take over the rest of Europe. How many years is that going to take him? If you do the math on how much of Ukraine he's taken, and you look at even, I don't know if there's been much movements in the lines, but let's assume there is. What's the math on how long till he gets to Poland? Can someone do those forecasts? And then from Poland to the next area? What are we looking at? In 1,000 years from now, Putin might go and take over all of Europe? I mean, if we're so concerned about this, where's the forecast based on current performance of how soon the guy even gets to Poland? So what is this? Something I have to be concerned about in 100 years? This war is still important because Russia is losing, and you can read about it in the Daily Mail. And I was like, all right, I'll go read about that in the Daily Mail. You're still claiming that we've got an opportunity to win this thing? What do you got for me, Boris Johnson? And so in the first part of the article, he great spin. I guess this guy was a decent politician when he was lying about COVID being a problem and partying. But anyways, so you've got Boris Johnson, and his first part of the article was, I would never have talked the Ukrainians out of a peace deal. It was because of their resolve and their strength as a people. There was no way of getting in the way of the Ukrainians wanting to get out there and battle. All right, that's his claim. It had nothing to do with him. But then this is when he tries to pitch that this is still a winnable fight. So let's give it a read. On the contrary, by investing only a fraction of the U.S. defense budget, you can help those valiant Ukrainians to turn the tide, put Putin back in the box, and therefore help secure the Euro-Atlantic areas for a generation without actually risking a single U.S. soldier. Okay? You can show the world that trying to change the borders by force will lead to disaster, because the greatest lie of all, and I'm just going to move forward a little bit. I might be out of frame while I read this. And the one Putin hoped most to protect by his interview is that the Russian leader is bound to win. He is no more invincible than Adolf Hitler. In fact, he is bound to lose. He has already suffered colossal losses, but That is not the point. Whatever Ukrainian territory he temporarily occupies, he can never conquer their spirit. I hope and believe that if President Trump is elected again, he will confound his critics, turn his party around, and complete the work that he began when he became the first U.S. president to give arms to Ukraine. I say that because in the end, all U.S. presidents know that our collective security is indivisible. In the end, the Americans can be relied upon to do the right thing, having exhausted, as the old saying has it, all the available alternatives. Tucker Carlson did us a favor last night in the sense that he proffered the alternative, a Putin victory, the destruction of Ukraine, and the descent of much of Europe once again into darkness and fear. It cannot and must not happen. There you go. This is still a winnable fight, and so we have to continue spending money, because if we spend money, Putin will actually take a loss, go back, and everyone will realize we cannot test borders or take things by force. And so this was Rand Paul responding. I mean, he wasn't responding to Boris Johnson, but this was Rand Paul on the same topic. And I think, like, at least, can you guys articulate the $86 billion strategy? Can you articulate what the path to victory is? Because there was Boris Johnson going, hey, this is still winnable. Go read my article. I read the article. Did he tell us how it's still winnable? No, he just said that this is still winnable. And if we don't win it, then, you know, it's still kind of this line. Democracy as we know it will never exist on planet Earth. If we let people know that you can go and take territories by force, then we can never have a... And then, of course, what does America do when we're bombing all over the place and forcing them to have our bases over there? But we're not talking about those kind of things. But can you at least articulate to us what the path to victory is? You're telling me, hey, we just need another $86 billion. What does the $86 billion do? How does that get you to winning the war? Can you explain it? Does anyone have an idea here? I don't understand what the pathway to victory possibly could be here. And then there you go. They just self-reference. You can go read it about in my article. And then it's just, you go to the article and it's just more assurances of, well, how? How does this make a difference? What does this do? And so here, just to hear the alternative opinion, let's listen to Rand Paul.
Disgusting. On both sides of the aisle, no big deal. It's helping our defense industrial base. It's another word for the military industrial complex, because even Eisenhower warned 70-some years ago, he warned that there was a danger that the military industrial complex would get so big that it wouldn't be policy led by Congress, that the corporations would become so big, trillion-dollar corporations grabbing up money, that they would direct policy. That it would no longer be you voting or no longer be us voting, but it would be the corporate interests who make the profits would be driving this. And I think we've become eerily close to that.
And essentially what he's saying is that we're not even really arguing that we can win the war at this point. It's that we can make money for the defense contractors. That's the new pitch to the American people.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
Russia has been rebuffed by the West. I mean, Vladimir Putin, I'm not flacking for Putin. I'm an American. I'm not going to live in Russia. I don't love Vladimir Putin. I'm stating the facts. He asked Bill Clinton to join NATO. He tried to make a missile deal.
He mentioned this in the interview.
He did, that's correct. And he's mentioned it in other forums as well. And NATO said, no, we don't want you. Now, if the point of NATO, originally, of course, the post-war goal of NATO was to keep the Russians, the Soviets, from coming into Western Europe. It was a bulwark against the Russians. So if the Russians asked you to join the alliance, that would suggest you have solved the problem and you can move on to do something constructive with your life. But we refused. And so, I mean, just meditate on that. Go sit in the sauna for an hour and think about what that means.
Very important point. And actually, I had a clip when I was on Timcast IRL about a year ago now. I had just finished reading Scott Horton's latest masterpiece that is still not released, called Provoked, that gives the entire history of not just the Russia-Ukraine war, but really how it came to pass, expansion post-91 after the fall of the USSR. And I do this 3-minute rant. It's still my pin tweet at Liberty Lockpod if you want to go watch it. So Tucker's analysis there is really important. And it's really, really important that his audience, to the tunes of hundreds of millions of people, are hearing it. That, yes, Vladimir Putin, as well as other leaders, I think... I'm blanking on his name, not Gorbachev, the guy after him. Anyways, doesn't matter. They asked to be added to NATO. They said, look, Cold War's over. Let's go. And the Clinton administration, as I described on that Timcast rant, they laughed him off. They said, we'll pass. Not interested. The explicit purpose of NATO, to prevent Russia from threatening Western Europe. Russia didn't want to threaten Western Europe. They wanted to stop. They wanted to end that standoff. They wanted to move forward. And I think Tucker's point is, he says, go in the sauna, reflect on this. You should absolutely do that. When I was reading Scott's book, that's all I did. All I did was reflect on what the fuck happened. You had an opportunity to take the largest nuclear power off of the enemy side of the map and put them into the civilized, we're not going to blow up the world part of the map, assuming that's what the West is, which I'm not so sure it is anymore. But we had that opportunity and they didn't take it. And now look at where we are. And I think that the answer, if you reflect on it, is that they wanted a perennial enemy. that exactly as Eisenhower warned, that the military-industrial complex's claws are too deeply into our political establishment and that they are not interested in peace, that they want forever wars, that they want global domination, not cooperation. That's what they've been about for decades. Contrary to the benefits or the desires or the demands of the American people or the people of the world. They're not interested in that. That's not their primary driving concern. And I'm not even sure it's on the list of their concerns, aside from assuaging us adequately so that we don't revolt. That's really the only concerns that they have for us at all. I know that sounds dark, and in some ways it is, but I think it's very important that we realize this is the mindset, this is the worldview of the people that rule over us. They are not interested in peace and prosperity. They are interested in conquest and monopolization. They want to have everything, all of the resources, the assets, the capacity to print wealth. They want the power, and they want total global dominance, and your liberties are not even on their list of concerns.
I can't overstate how incapacitated Joe Biden is. That's not an attack. That is a fact. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. So these are not decisions Joe Biden is making. But there are capable people around Biden, and I know them. What they lack is any perspective at all. So a conversation with a U.S. policymaker about the history of the region would begin and end with a conversation about, of course, Chamberlain and Churchill and Hitler. Period. So the American policymaker historical template is tiny. In fact, there's only one. And it's a 2-year period in the late 1930s. And everything is based on that understanding of history and human nature. And that's insane. And so actually, American policymakers have convinced themselves that Vladimir Putin is going to take over Poland. And it is not a defense of Putin. I don't mean to defend Putin. I'm not a fan of Putin's, and I'm not a subject of Putin's. I'm an American. However, there's no evidence that Putin has any interest in expanding his borders. He is the largest country in the world, and it's very hard to run. They don't need natural resources. There's nothing in Poland he wants. There's nothing he will gain by taking Poland other than more trouble. If you're saying that he's going to invade Poland, you don't know what you're talking about.
Here is a point in the interview when you asked him, are you ready to invade Poland?
Are you an expansionist power?
Expansion, yes, in Poland. He said only if Poland launched a war,
of course,
on Russia. Okay? Ukraine did not launch a war on Russia, and he invaded Ukraine. Why you didn't follow up on this question?
I started with that question, actually, but he treated me to 35 minutes of Catherine the Great and the Rus. But no, the core question is, why did he move his forces into eastern Ukraine? And I watched this from a distant vantage in the United States, and I watched the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, go to the Munich Security Conference just days before that, in February of 2022, and say in a public forum, at a press conference to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, we want you to join NATO, which is another way of saying, it's a synonym for, we plan to put nuclear weapons on Russia's border.
For those that think that Tucker may be overstating it, that Kamala Harris would never do such a thing, especially when Russia was already staging on their border, on the Ukrainian border.
I appreciate and admire President Zelensky's desire to join NATO. And one of, again, the founding principles of NATO is that each country must have the ability, unimpaired, unimpeded, to determine their own future, both in terms of their form of government, and in this case, whether they desire to be a member of NATO. And I'll put that in context because the obvious is also the point, which is that, and therefore no other country can tell anyone whether they should or should not join NATO. That should be their independent choice. That is the point of sovereignty. So I respect President Zelensky's desire to be a member of NATO.
So there you have it. Did Tucker lie? Or was he telling the exact truth? And this has actually been a point I've highlighted many times, that this was intentionally provocative. The State Department is obviously Kamala and Biden and everybody else. They all knew the reddest of red lines. It was told to Burns, the current CIA director, when he was talking to Condoleezza Rice over a decade ago. They knew. Reddest of red lines. Ukraine cannot be added to NATO. If they intend to, it will ultimately amount to Russia invading Ukraine to prevent it.
Crazy, but here's a story. It's from The Cradle. It's a great publication, by the way. It came out yesterday. Australian MPs vote overwhelmingly in favor of freedom for Julian Assange. Turn on that next one if you can. This is from the article. Australian MPs, including Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and members of his cabinet, have voted overwhelmingly in favor of urging the US and UK to allow embattled WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to return to his home country of Australia. Let him go home. In the federal parliamentary vote on 14 January saw 86 in favor of freeing him and 42 against. 2-to-1 odds the members of his own parliament said, come on, guys, enough is enough. Let him come home. And Australia's our ally. We should be listening to them.
Yeah, it is a real tragedy. And, it's not like there's a law that everybody understands. It's been around a long time and it applies to foreigners and anything we want. But the espionage has been around since 1917. Yeah. And it's well known to be not a protection of our civil liberties at all. So that is a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. And the people have to rise up, and not enough people know about it. So hopefully some good could come of it, and more information get out, because we can't fight them. All those governments, and they're all brainwashed into them. This is important. Our national security depends on peace in the world. Democracy exists. Yeah. We have to protect the dictatorship of the majority. What would we do if we couldn't fudge that thing around very much anymore?
This is Politico who wrote about it. Several hours later. I think this came out today. The quote, I like how they have disturbing in quotes because it's appropriate. The disturbing intel roiling the hill is about Russian nukes in space. So that's what it's about. And go to the next one. This is what the whole scare warning was about. A vague warning by the chair of the House Intelligence Committee about a serious national security threat Wednesday is related to Russia's attempts to develop an anti-satellite nuclear weapon for use in space. Now go to the next one. This gives you the more detail about it and also the timing. In a statement Wednesday morning, Turner said his committee had made available information, etc. Now, this is the part that I underlined. It's not clear what prompted Turner to issue the statement now, as the intelligence has been available to leaders of the House Intel Committee and their top aides in a secure room for more than a week. Others say longer, one of the people said. So this is kind of old info. It's nothing new. And then all of a sudden, he releases it in a very scary way. The question is, what's going on? What's the story about this timing? That's it. Well, Mike Lee, senator from Utah, who very often has good tweets, he's worth a follow. He also has another theory about why this terrible, scary thing just came out. Put up his tweet up here, tweet post on X. Yeah, that's a good take on it. He says, he reposts the statement from Mike Turner about this terrible threat. And Senator Lee says, very interested to learn about this threat. Also, very interested to know why the spy guys are raising mysterious alarms right before we're about to reform illegal domestic surveillance under FISA. So he's suggesting here that this is a smokescreen for reauthorizing that FISA, the 720, I guess.
Yeah, and they all do come together. They probably have backups. On a different appropriation. If they miss it in one, they can slip it in, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, it was put in this other bill. Yeah. And that's why the people are so cynical, and they should be, because whether it's economic reports or foreign policy reports, the trust of our government has just diminished tremendously, and this is a positive because they don't tell us the truth very often.
Now this is interesting, especially for us. We spend a lot of time on the Hill. We're interested in the different kinds of maneuvers that happen there. We know the issue about this $90-some billion national security supplemental, and we know that Johnson doesn't want to bring it to the floor. Speaker Johnson doesn't want to bring it to the floor without the border stuff, and now he's so committed that he kind of can't because it'd be backing down. Well, here's the new move that they're trying to do now. Put this next one up. This is from Zero Hedge. House Democrats eye backdoor to force vote on Ukraine and Israel funding. If you do the next one just really quick, I'll say what it is for our audience. What they're going to be pursuing is a discharge petition. You need 218 signatures, which means the support of Republicans to force the legislation to the floor. Now, you and Dennis Kucinich did this a lot when it came to anti-war Iraq stuff, and you were joined by a lot of others. It's an interesting tool to use.
It is a good tool, and it's been around. The founders thought it was a good tool, and it's also, if you have to recognize that you don't take the strategy and say, well, we don't want to be embarrassed and call it up and not win the vote. Yeah. Well, the purpose is to get some attention to it, and maybe more people will join. Yeah. And I think, what are they trying to get up? Another 100 billion almost, 60 for Ukraine and 14 for Israel, and 9 for Gaza.
Yeah, he hasn't done a great job of herding the cats, of running a tight ship so far. The only thing he really has going for him right now is that the moderates haven't rebelled. If they kick him in the face, I just wonder if this is going to be the death knell, figuratively speaking, for Speaker Johnson as Speaker Johnson.
I wouldn't be surprised because they're talking about putting Kevin back in. But that would be a real coup, wouldn't it? Oh, I'm going to be Speaker again.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to be a member to be Speaker, as we've said on this show, so you better keep by your phone, too. Can you imagine trying to keep those guys in line? I mean, that would be a nightmare.
I don't think it would work very
well. I would not wish it on the worst.
I'd probably be able to give my first speech.
I'm going home.
How did we ever find you? But that was their way of treating me, because they were always polite, but they knew that what I was talking about was so extreme, obeying the Constitution every time. They didn't need that extreme attitude. So.
Well, you reminded them what they all professed but didn't really take seriously, and that's what made them so irritated.
That's for sure.